So, good afternoon to those of you steadily joining. And we have many, many people who registered for this event. So I'm just giving it a couple of to let all of you come in and join. And this, of course, our first EPC update of the autumn, our regular look at the key developments in and around the European Union, today focusing on that speech that Ursula von der Leyen gave this morning in the European Parliament, her fourth, possibly last, State of the Union address. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, and Fabian Zuleeg, the Chief Executive. In this special edition of Update, as I said, we are focusing entirely on that speech given to the European Parliament this morning. What did President von der Leyen say? What does it mean, not just for the EU's agenda over the next 12 months, the last year of this Commission, but potentially also for the upcoming European Parliament elections and indeed for the European Commission? And what didn't she say? We're going to discuss all of that. As always, a totally interactive session, questions from me to Fabian and Janis, and I hope later on from all of you. Your mic muted. If you want to ask a question when I open up to the floor, click on the hand-shaped button on your right, and I will unmute you when the time comes. Or you can write your question as soon as it occurs to you. Just click on, as always, the Q&A button, not the chat button. And please, please, please be as brief as possible. Questions, not statements, so that I can see at a glance what your question is. So let's get underway. We have an awful lot of ground to cover. It was a very long speech, over an hour long. Janis, in terms of the overarching message, the State of the Union, how did you see it? She called it answering the call of history. How did that leitmotif run through it? And were there any surprises?
Well, first of all, yes, this was the theme they had given, the need to answer to the call of history. It started with that, it ended with that. And there was a strong words of pathos assigned to it. But I would say yet, although this was the overarching theme, the key message that she was trying to convey is, first of all, how well the Commission has done over the past 4 years. Now, this was, as you said, the last of the Ursula von der Leyen #1 Commission. Let's see whether there will be a second one. And that traditionally is being used as an opportunity to showcase of how successful the work of the Commission, of that Commission, has been. She said that they deliver on 90% of the political guidelines to be discussed, because if you look into the political guidelines of 2019, there's a question of how they technically have actually been able to address, and at the end of actually how much they have been able not only to technically implement, but how much have we progressed on the different files which they had put on the agenda. And I think that we're well behind the 90%. In terms of the was it a call on the EU to reflect the needs of history? I think she didn't go far enough. She addressed a lot of different issues. By the way, some issues she did not really address, for example, like defense and security, but she addressed a lot of different issues. But on many points, she was either not very concrete or ambitious. And other things, as I said, she didn't even mention. So in terms of looking towards the future, she was trying to convey that there is still a lot we need to do in answer to history. But on the other hand, I think she missed an opportunity to also mention some of the major challenges we're having in terms of being ambitious enough. So it's not only about saying we need to be ambitious, but also why we're not actually ambitious enough as an EU 27.
Come back on what you felt was missing a little bit later. But Fabian, just to kick off our discussion, your overall assessment of the speech, tone and content.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly it was a competent speech. She did, I think, what she set out to do. If we look at the content, I think, yes, we have to take into account also at what stage the Commission and her presidency is at. There was bound to be a lack of concreteness around some of these issues, given that there's not going to be a legislative program until the next Commission. Yes, there's things to complete, but new things are really not on the card for quite a while yet. But I think for me, the key question is what you measure it against. if you measure it against the ambitions which the Commission set out at the beginning of the mandate, if we measure it against what could have been expected, we measure it against the challenges which have appeared, certainly not only the continuation of the climate crisis, but also the challenge with COVID and the challenge with Russia's war of aggression. If you measure it against all that, I think the Commission has done rather well. There have been limitations, but it has done rather well. But for me, what is most important is really to be forward-looking. And what we should be measuring it against is what are the challenges which we are facing. And I'm afraid if I do that, then for me, we are still trying to address exponential challenges with linear policies.
Mm. And indeed, therefore, the question or that it set out or the plea that it made to answer the call of history, you would say it's not, because it's precisely those huge challenges at this defining moment that you feel are not being addressed.
Yeah. I mean, I would rephrase it slightly. I would say answer the call of the future. I think this is what we need to do. We need to actually address the incredibly difficult time period we are having ahead of us. And I think one of the key things here, and I'm sure we'll come back to that also in the discussion, is to also address the trade-offs between the different areas. And one of the things which I think she has done in this speech is there was a little bit for everybody. There was trying to address the concerns of many different constituencies. But the question is, can we do all of that simultaneously? And where do we set priorities? Where do we actually make compromises? Where do we have these trade-offs? And that is politically the far more difficult question, but that is the call of history or the call of the future, which we're facing now.
And I do indeed want to come back to that in a number of areas a little bit later on. But just, Fabian, to follow up Janis's point about, she started actually with a reference to the European elections, but she also started with that claim 90% of our agenda, my political guidelines that I set at the beginning of my mandate, have been delivered. Janis is saying, yeah, there have been a lot of achievements, going back metric of how you measure, but he expressing some cynicism over the boldness of that claim. Where do you stand in terms of the track record? Just looking back for a moment, and then I want to turn indeed to look at the future, as you say. What is your assessment of the achievements of the Commission? Did she paint an accurate picture, or was it somewhat overblown?
I think my answer is similar to Janis, but I would express it maybe slightly differently. And that's bringing in the think tank perspective to this. I think what we shouldn't be focusing on is the activities. What we should be focusing on is the impact. And that's the real question, is what has actually changed, whether you have done 70%, 90%, 10% of what you set out at the beginning. Question is, what has that changed in terms of the challenges which we are facing? And there, I think we should be more self-critical. That's not an attack on this Commission or on her personally or on her record. That is just, for me, a feature of better policy making, that we actually are very honest about what have we addressed and what is still outstanding, because then it does have a relevance for the future, which, as I said, is the most important bit.
Indeed, and there was relatively little on what has not worked so well. It was all about what we have managed to do. We'll come back to whether that was inevitable in the year before an election campaign and a new legislative cycle in a little while. But Janis, in terms of priorities, Fabian saying there was something for everyone. A lot of things were mentioned. I'm not going to enumerate all of them. But in terms of what really will be the priorities in this last year of this Commission, was it clear to you where the focus will be? And you mentioned that you felt some things were missing. What were they?
Well, first of all, I think a strong indication is where she started in her speech and where she ended. And she started with the European Green Deal. where, by the way, she said that this was our answer to the call of history. That was a quote. So what she was saying is that was the answer we have given and are giving to history calling on us to deliver. So the Green Deal obviously remains enormously high on the agenda, while looking into to take the term that Fabian already used, also looking the trade-offs within that area, because there is an increasing discussion, as we all know, about how we deal with the different aspects related to the Green Deal, how fast we are in certain sectors, how we're trying to cushion the negative effects, how does it affect our economies and so forth. So she started with the Green Deal, and that remains high, very high on the agenda. And she ended up with Ukraine and enlargement. So that was a manifestation of actually we're moving towards a new era in terms of the need to enlarge the EU, and we need to prepare for that. And she said some of the things which the current commission still wants to do. But at the same time, she was not very concrete. But I think these were the things which she started off and she ended with. And I think that gives a strong indication. But as we said, she was discussing and dealing with a lot of things on in between, whether they had to do with migration, whether they had to do with artificial intelligence, with competitiveness, which I already mentioned. Biological diversity, by the way, was something which she highlighted very strongly, and in the green dimension, but still. So she addressed a lot of different issues, while that's a bit of an analysis, if you look into them more concretely, while trying not to annoy anyone. I think it was
Come back on why
strong...
she didn't want to annoy anyone in a moment. Can I just
say... by the way, but that's not new, huh? Because obviously I know what you want to link it to, but she also did so in the past. So that's a way how she approaching things in more general terms. When you mention what she didn't mention enough, I think it was defense. There is one reference to defense, but it's by no means at the level of what is needed, given it into account the global Zeitenwende that we're experiencing, also when it comes to geopolitics. And the second, which was interesting, she did not refer to participation, which was something that she did refer to. Now, the democracy, she highlighted.
Thank you very much. Let me just stay, if I could, for a moment with the European Green Deal, Fabian, because in this section, her focus, this is really what led to a very large chunk of the speech, focused on the economy, on competitiveness, on industrial strategy. Huge, I lost count of the number of times she talked about competitiveness. She also talked about that new report that she's asked former ECB President Mario Draghi to prepare on Europe's future competitiveness. Was this, do you think, you said you were critical that the trade-offs weren't being addressed. Was this an attempt to address those trade-offs? Was it simply to appease the European People's Party? She's been coming under criticism from Manfred Weber and others of the impact of the Green Deal on industry and on its competitiveness. How did you read this and repetition of the emphasis she's putting on this?
I think there are different levels you can look at this from. I think one element definitely is also what is happening in Germany and the kind of discussion we are seeing around what is seen by some as too intrusive green measures which are affecting households. I think there is also, and that has been voiced by many businesses at the European sector, is also a concern around not the aims of the Green Deal, because I think that is very widely shared, but the method and the way Europe is legislating, putting through enormous amounts of legislation. In a sense, this is going back to the first question around success measures. One of the success measures is how much legislation this commission has actually helped to steer through the system. But that also creates a burden. And I think she tried very hard to make the argument that the Green Deal is good for growth, is good for business, But there were also hints about addressing some of these challenges. But again, and I think this is something we've seen in many areas, there's a lack of concreteness as well.
I was going to say, is this a change of direction, or is it really an acknowledgement of that criticism, do you think?
Well, I think it's an acknowledgement, first of all. I think there are some hints of areas where there's going to be more action, and probably the bit which actually had the most resonance in many countries was the investigation into Chinese electric vehicles. That really created a reaction in the press, where the rest of the speech didn't really have that much effect. But I think there's still a lack of concreteness about many of these issues. And with all respect for Mario Draghi, but I'm not sure that what we need at this moment in time is another report. I think there are quite a number of concrete areas which could be addressed. And it would be, in my view, better to actually initiate some of these policies. But again, we're at the end of a mandate. It's very difficult to now kick off new things until presumably we'll have the next mandate, very probably with the same person.
Just briefly move on and still focusing on the economic side for a minute, Fabian. On digitalization, on artificial intelligence, there was a lot in the speech on artificial intelligence. Was anything new? Anything did it point us to any new approach, new initiatives?
I don't think there's very much new in it. I think it's a continuation of the direction we've been going in. For me, it is actually rather worrying. I think even if you look at the wording in the speech, when we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about our ability of legislating. We're talking about the Brussels effect. We're not actually talking about being in the lead on artificial intelligence. We're in the lead on the legislation of artificial intelligence. I think that, for me, is a rather worrying sign if you put it together with the whole argument around competitiveness. Because if we want to have the competitiveness we need, we also need to be much more present in the future technologies, in the enabling technologies, of which artificial intelligence is definitely one.
Thank you. Janis, just on this economic chapter of the speech, as it were, your reaction, and did you feel that it was a recognition, a more explicit recognition than in the past, of trade-offs all the time, as Fabian was saying, trying to say this is a growth agenda. That's what we've made it. We've made it a growth agenda. But did you feel there was a significant shift? Do you think this indicates that some elements of the Green Deal are being blown off course by the criticism?
I think what it clearly structurally shows is that how difficult it is becoming. If you compare it to 5 years ago or 4 years ago, if you compare it to the time when the Green Deal was put on the Commission, von der Leyen's Commission agenda as number one, we were living in a different situation, because it was easier to argue the case that this should be high on the agenda, because the more you get to the point where you actually need to deliver, the more difficult it becomes. So this is where the trade-offs then show themselves, where you need to take tough decisions, where you are increasingly under pressure. And what Fabian mentioned in the beginning, and she feels that pressure very much also from Germany. From within the current German government, where the liberals are at times furious at what's coming from von der Leyen and from the von der Leyen Commission. So it's from the coalition government itself, but also from, you already mentioned, the EPP. So the CDU, you hear also some critical voices. And so when it becomes tough to actually deliver on policies because some of the difficult choices have to be made, then you need to become more concrete. And that's where not only she, but also she as the Commission president is struggling. And especially if you do not want to annoy political actors, whether at home, in this case, Germany, or in general, whether it is the parliament or the council, if this is an aspiration you have, while trade-offs are becoming more significant and you need to provide answers to the necessary trade-offs, and then it becomes difficult because you're maneuvering yourselves in a terrain where you're actually not making the progress you need. And that links to what we were discussing in the beginning, is, are we then bold enough? And when she says, when Europe is bold, it gets things done, that is correct. But the question is whether we're bold enough, and whether she and others, so let's not put only the blame on her, whether we at the European level are bold enough and also able as an EU 27 to be bold enough and united enough. So there's a lot of talk about unity, but at the end we see how many differences there are. And so the Commission President, whoever it is, by the way, is also trying to maneuver her or his way through an increasingly difficult terrain.
Indeed. I want to turn to enlargement in a moment, but before I do that, just coming back on this point you've both made about this was a speech with something for everyone in it. If you see the comments, the section of the speech on the Green Deal, partly as that nod, that answer to EPP critics on the competitiveness issue, there was also announcement of a new social partners summit next year under the Belgian presidency. So a big emphasis there, perhaps a nod to the S&D group in the parliament, and then also a significant dialogue, she announced, on the future of agriculture in the European Union. Again, a lot of praise. She paid tribute to farmers for providing the food that we eat. She said they were working hard to deliver more sustainable agriculture. I just wondered what was behind that. Is this again trade-offs debate? Does this reflect something that's happening in Germany and in France to an extent, again linked to the Green Deal? Janis, how did you read those different sections? Is this simply trying to take all those key constituencies and keep them all happy, as you indicated at the beginning?
Yes, it is a grand coalition speech. It is trying to make sure that all the different elements also of a future coalition, which again raises the question of her aspirations with respect to 24 onwards. And we can assume that there will be a need for a grand coalition, even more so if critical EU political forces will do well in the next EP elections. So she actually is picking up on all the different constituencies and trying to make everyone happy. Now, you could say, is this new? Probably not, because you see that always also ahead of a State of the Union address, and that everyone is trying to get their interests into a speech, and those who then deliver the speech, whoever the Commission President is, trying to reflect it in one way or the other. But I think in terms of this speech, it was very much a grand coalition speech, trying to reflect the different interests, trying to please the different actors, and make sure, which is the other side of the coin, not to annoy anyone. Also, we're talking about it, if we talk about enlargement in a second, this was another area where this was the case. So I think this is something, a thread that goes through the entire speech. And I think that at the end of the day, this is counterproductive, because if normal European citizens would be listening to the speech, and I doubt that many will, but if they would listen, I think many of them would not feel themselves reflected in what is being said. They would be saying, is this actually the picture of the state of the European Union? Many would say, my appreciation of the state of the European Union, or as a member state of this European Union, is a different one. I see all these different problems, all these different challenges. I think I see that things are getting more difficult, more uncertain, and I feel that actually things are not being delivered. And even from a pro-European perspective, so it's not from someone who's critical of the EU, she or he might say, it's not enough that's being done. So you hear that speech, and I think from a citizen's perspective, you might then wonder, are we living in the same union? So I think this is counterproductive also in view of the EP elections of next year.
Let's come back on that. Hang on. I want to hold that thought.
Sure.
Hold that thought. Fabian, you wanted to come in on this point.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly agreeing with Janis, I would also add on that there is also clearly what we've seen politically in the Netherlands with the Dutch farmers, and I think that also played in the background. If I'm very kind, I would say it's also maybe an attempt to flag up some of the risks and the politically hairy issue which are coming up in future.
Yeah.
There is this whole question of economic security, including food security, which wasn't very explicitly addressed. I see that clearly it's difficult to do that in this speech, but I think the risks weren't really highlighted. There's the question of climate populism, and we've seen more and more protests against climate action. To put it shortly, climate action is starting to hurt, so we're starting to see the political consequences of that. And in this particular context, leading smoothly to enlargement, I think there's also the big question of what do we do with agriculture at the European level in the context of Ukrainian enlargement? Because what we have at the moment cannot function with a country like Ukraine inside the Union.
Which will link to the pledge that she made to the Commission starting on what she called pre-enlargement policy reviews about the impact on certain policies of enlargement. We'll come back on that in just a second. But in terms of the overarching message, Janis, to Ukraine, to the Western Balkans, to Moldova, she said, and she repeated it several times, their future, and I quote, lies in our union. But she said, we will still take a merit-based approach, indicating there probably won't be a target date set. And she said, we know it won't be an easy road. Was there anything really new in here? I'll come to that of the equation, which was when she talked about the EU preparing itself for that enlargement. But in terms of the message to the applicant countries, and particularly to Ukraine, was there anything new? And a question from the audience to throw in there. Isa Yurekli asks, in the speech, she made an inspiring call, re-enlargement to EU 30-plus countries. However, she noticeably didn't mention Turkey's EU future. How do you interpret this significant omission, and what impact do you think it might have on Turkey's relationship and the overall enlargement process? So what did she say, and was there anything new in what she said to the countries she did mention, and what do we read into the lack of any mention of Turkey?
I'll answer to that question, but just one point, because it was also in the part which was dealing with Ukraine, or at least the beginning of that part. I think it's important to note that she said that the EU should show the same unity of purpose towards Africa as we have shown for Ukraine. I think that's a strong message. It's not something which I think is being picked up a lot. But if you actually think it through what it means to show the same unity of purpose that you show towards Ukraine, which obviously is extremely high on the agenda and is asking questions about fundamental questions about the future of the EU with respect to enlargement and deepening, that she puts it at the same level. And I think that that is a message which I think we should not omit. That's why I explicitly mentioned it now. When it comes to enlargement, and obviously linked to that, EU reforms, she told us that we should no longer think binary. It's not widening or deepening. That's not new, but she reminded us of the need to do so. So when it comes to enlargement, I think that on the equation of the EU preparing itself for future rounds of enlargement, she was talking about a completed union, so about progressing substantially, but actually when it comes to the tough cookies, she was not concrete. No. So saying we need a pre-enlargement policy review, I think makes sense. Although the question is what actually will come out of that. And that's something to be delivered during the Belgian presidency. She said that it will be delivered as input during the Belgian presidency. So it's something which should come imminently. But she did not actually call for what I would call a governance review, which we also need. She was saying that if treaty change is necessary, we will have it. But actually, we have proven that we are efficient, that treaty reform is not a must before enlargement. So in terms of the need to reform the EU more substantially beyond policies, and I'm not saying that policy reforms in terms of a potentially enlarging EU are not significant. Obviously, they are significant when you talk about, we already mentioned, agriculture, if you look into structural policy, if you look into into budgetary questions, policy review is immensely significant. But on the other side of the equation, she is not very concrete. Actually, a way like in the past, it's not new, she is shying away from the governance question. So she's supportive of what the European Parliament is asking for of a convention if there's a need to change the treaties. But she doesn't say there is an explicit need to change the treaties beyond what the Lisbon Treaty allows us to do. So here she shies away from doing that. And I think that that's another omission. And if you're actually serious about progressing with respect to enlargement and having also a high pace, and we should not assume that we will be able to reform the EU in one go, that was, in terms of the level of ambition, not far enough from my perspective.
Indeed. I want to come back to the message to the countries themselves in a moment. But Fabian, as Janis was pointing out, she talked a lot about what had been achieved at 27 and kept saying, I believe, for example, on a health union, we can finish it at 30 plus. She talked about a European Defence Union, what had been achieved at 27. I believe we can finish it at 30 plus, etc., etc. Team Europe, she said, works at 30 plus. An indication that while perhaps giving a nod to the Parliament on conventions, not shutting the door on treaty reform, for the sake of member states where the idea is much less popular, she was indicating that she doesn't think it's a road we necessarily need to go down. Is that how you read it?
I mean, I think there was a very clear attempt at not committing to either side.
I like that, a very clear attempt not to commit.
Yeah, a very clear attempt to sit on the fence. Because I think on the one hand, she paid lip service to, yes, we can do a convention, etc., but then in the same section of the speech, she talks about how much can be done without it and that we can actually make huge progress. So in a sense, it's again addressing both and saying, yes, we can do both. I think the reality is that, again, and maybe that's not the right moment in this speech, but there are really tough cookies behind us where we are going to have to make rather fundamental political choices, and they are political. When we are talking, for example, about decision making, how are we going to reform decision making? How are we going to deal with member states who are blocking progress for everyone else? How are we dealing with the very difficult questions around renationalization of certain policies, etc.? I would suspect that many of these will also require a new look at the treaties. But she wasn't going into any of the real issues. It was more about giving an overall positive message, which is welcome. But I think the question has to be if this doesn't become a never-ending process, if it's not something where we are just going to go from State of the Union to State of the Union, every time reiterating that it would be a good thing if only we made enough progress to enable it. The question is concretely, what is it that needs to change? And what is the plan to make those changes?
Janis, you want to come in? Let me just read a comment from Philippe de Buc saying, on enlargement, it seems to be forgotten there is a need of a unanimous decision of the member states with the need of a referendum in some countries. Just throw that into the mix. But you wanted to react to something Fabian said.
Yes, because there are two things. One thing is the sentence which she has used also in the past when it comes to treaty change is that if it is needed.
Yeah.
But if you read the two sentences afterwards, she says, but if we cannot change the treaties, we should not wait for treaty change to move ahead with enlargement. And that a union fit for enlargement can be achieved faster. So what she's indicating is that actually, if we cannot achieve it, knowing that the 27 do not agree on it, and yes, it's not only with respect to enlargement that you need unanimity, but also with respect to treaty change, and especially when it comes to ratifying, it needs to be ratified by all in each and every member state. What she indicates to that is that actually, if treaty change is not possible, let's do it without it. And I wonder, one, how that can be get into line with a maximalist position from the European Parliament. As we are now discussing, the European Parliament is presenting its proposals more concretely to the public, and it has a very maximalist approach. So how do you square that circle? And the second, if you look into the list of what has been achieved, She speaks of next generation use, she speaks of vaccines, of sanctions, purchase natural gas. These have all been things that have been achieved in an immediate reaction to severe crisis moments.
Yeah.
But when it comes to proactively reforming and enabling the EU to be ready to address the challenges of the future and to be bold enough, you need more than that. So there's a contradiction of saying we're able to deliver if we need to, and we can work on the basis of the current treaty and the current governance structures, while at the same time being bold.
Okay, we need to move on in a moment. Fabian, I know you want to come in, but please do pick up also on the message her speech sent to Ukraine, to Moldova, to the Western Balkans, and also the omission of any reference to Turkey, whether you see any significance in that. Fabian.
I was going to just specifically pick up the Turkey question and to say that I think in many ways, to say very bluntly, having the victory of Erdogan has removed the problem because you don't have to then seriously think about Turkey's accession process. I think this very much indicates that it's at the end of the list, also in terms of consideration, and that there's no realistic prospect of making any progress for the coming period. There are so many problems already associated with those countries where there is momentum, where there is a geopolitical pressure that Turkey just is falling off the wagon.
And those enlargement countries, of course, will be looking to the next summit, the informal summit in Granada, coming up in the autumn, later in the autumn, and also a meeting of the European political community. Do you think, I mean, it seemed to me very much that it was the same message that has been delivered before. This will be done on merits, it will be hard, but we are committed to it. Was there anything, did you read, Fabian, new in that?
Not really. And I think this whole emphasis on merit I think is also questionable, because I think we have to look at that and say, have we really always looked at it only from a merit perspective? I very much doubt that that has been the driving force between many of the decisions in the past. What we know with enlargement, and Philip's question also hints at that, is that what matters probably more than anything else is domestic politics in certain countries. And the question is, has anything really changed there? And how do we convince also those who are much more reluctant, who are thinking, frankly, of enlargement in a decade or longer rather than in the near future? That's a real question. I don't think she can answer that. But I think she could have hinted a bit more at also some of the political difficulties which are underlying the process.
Okay, very brief on that, Janis, because I want to move to external relations and to the issue that you've already mentioned, captured the headlines, namely China. And then I want to give a more overall assessment of where we are, upcoming elections and so on. Point about the message to Ukraine and the others.
Well, first of all, it was clearly not an omission that Turkey was not mentioned, which was a coincidental, that obviously was done on purpose. And so answering to that question, this is giving a signal. On the other hand, there is an attempt to find a way of re-energizing the relationship with Turkey, but not moving in the direction of actually trying to get Turkey closer to the European Union in actual terms following the election results. Fabian is totally right there. The other thing is, it is not only that there are some who believe that enlargement will not be necessary in 10 years. Let's not omit that there are also a good number who think that enlargement can still not happen, at least not a big enlargement, because they believe that the developments internal in member states, potential member states, will be such that they will not be actually transforming themselves along the lines of what is actually needed to become a member of the European Union, and that at the end of the day, and it's with a special reference and look into the situation in Ukraine, the situation might develop in a direction which will allow us not to enlarge. So there is also many of those who still believe that this is the road to be taken. I think this is that actually is misinterpreting the call of history.
Okay, coming to China in a minute, but Lucas Janssen raises the question of the rule of law. Lucas talks about the omission of rule of law from the list of topics addressed. It was addressed, but it was addressed so briefly, very easy to miss it. It was 2 sentences or so, and more in relation to rule of law reports and applicant countries, candidate countries. But he said no mention towards Poland and Hungary on this matter. Who wants to pick up on what we read into that?
Again, this was no coincidence. It was not mentioned, but she was asked about it, or it was referred to in responses to her speech. And when she then answered to those who responded to her speech, she took it up and she said something, but that was outside of the speech, because the speech actually, as you said, was talking about the rule of law dimension with respect to potential future EU countries.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to China, because I think, as you mentioned, Fabian, this issue really that's captured any media attention since the speech was delivered, and this launch of an anti-subsidy inquiry into low-cost electric vehicles coming from China. She talked about de-risking, not decoupling, a phrase she then used later on, also in reference to strategic autonomy. How significant is the launch of this new inquiry, and what does de-risking but not decoupling really mean?
On the anti-subsidy inquiry, I think we should be careful about not reading too much into it. It's an inquiry, and I would suspect it will be conducted very professionally. Probably will take quite a bit of time, but I think the key here is it is very much an attempt to depoliticize it, to say this is ultimately a technical inquiry which is going to be carried out. But clearly it is a response to an enormous political pressure which has been there, where many industries, particularly the car industry, has been demanding that the Commission does more to address competition, or what is seen as unfair competition from China. So in a sense, this is also a bit of a test balloon. It's let's see whether you can deal with these kind of challenges with these kind of means. I would suspect not, because I think this will rather involve a much broader view of economic security and how we deal with that. It's not a simple technical competitiveness issue, but I think she has tried to address the concerns which are there.
But you say making it, depoliticizing it would be a technical exercise, but she put it in the State of the Union speech, which is the most high-profile political speech she makes every year. So hasn't she raised the stakes for it?
Depoliticizing it in the sense of having a technical inquiry, not in the sense of paying political lip service to the importance of the issue, because clearly this is also inevitably having a reaction in China who will not be very happy. And this is also linked to the second question, which you posed. It is the question of what does de-risking actually mean, because there has also been some criticism of the concept. People have said that they don't understand what it means. If it doesn't mean cutting yourself off, then what does it mean? And I think this is also in part an attempt to respond to that, to say, and she emphasized very much how much the importance of trade with China and with others was still going to be there, but we will make it fairer. So this is an attempt, again, of squaring the circle, of achieving both at the same time.
Okay, Janis, unless you're burningly desiring to talk about this, I would like to come to the politics of all of this.
Just one point, and just one addition, because Fabian was rightly saying that obviously this is something which is being and will be very much noticed in China, but it's also noticed in other places around the world, and also including Washington, D.C. So let's not also forget that that's another dimension which you probably had in mind when she was pushing in the State of the Union speech, to make sure that that message is then also received across the Atlantic.
Okay. Coming to the politics of all of this, and you've touched on it really in a number of your answers to my questions. She didn't say whether she wants a second term as Commission President or not. No one really seriously expected her to do so. But a lot of the elements of the speech seem to be effectively a launch of an election campaign, underlining your achievements, talking about the way you see things going forward. Did you, Janis, see this as indeed the start of that campaign, or how do we read this? And linked to that do you agree with those who say this huge uncertainty over whether she wants a second term or not, or maybe she'd be more interested in the NATO Secretary General job that she's also been talked about a lot, that it's having negative effects on this commission and could on the next? How do you see this all playing out, and did the speech take us any further forward?
First of all, I think that the question of is it launching the election campaign, which you posed, but also others were asking themselves whether it will be actually the moment for her to reveal whether she is in an election campaign mode. She is in an election campaign mode, and she has been in an election campaign mode. And by the way, even if you look 1 year back and you read the 2022 State of the Union address, many of the things she said at the time, you can only understand if you see it through the election campaign perspective. So we are, and she is, in an election campaign mode. Now, you already highlighted in your question that it's not only about having a second Commission presidency mandate, but there's also the question of the Secretary General of NATO. And I think both play into the equation. And what I'm sure about, or rather confident about, is that she wants one of the two jobs. Now, whether it's one or the other and what she prefers, I think she's the only one who can answer that. But she wants one of these two.
And is it damaging for the Commission that she won't put her cards on the table?
If you see it very strictly, and probably also politically naively, from a Commission perspective, you could, yes, argue that it is not something which is positive from a Commission perspective. You can also hear from inside the Commission, up to higher rows within the Commission, that there is a certain unease about the fact that there's uncertainty as to what her future would look like. Now, even if it would be clear, it wouldn't be clear now as to whether she would get it, so there would still be an uncertainty. But there are people who are saying that this is hampering our work in the final stretch, but also in view of our preparation of the next Commission presidency.
And indeed, preparations for the election campaign to come.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the argument being that if we would prepare the files, the handover files to the next Commission, we would probably do so differently if we would not know anything with respect to who would be the next Commission president. But now, thinking that it might be her has an influence. So it is having an effect on this discussion and also on the preparation for the next cycle.
Thank you very much on that point, Fabian. But also, to what extent do you think, not all this speculation about Ursula von der Leyen, and Janis explained there the effect that is having, but also we've seen the departure in the last few weeks of two heavy hitters of the Commission, Frans Timmermans back to Dutch politics, Margrethe Vestager going to focus on her campaign to be president of the European Investment Bank. Does that make this now effectively a lame duck Commission? And if it does, realistically, how much can be achieved between now and the elections next year? I mean, are we basically writing off the next 6 months?
I think, firstly, this is not unusual. Towards the end of every Commission, the carousel is starting to turn and people are looking at what are they going to do afterwards. And that there are a number of people who know that their future is not going to be in the Commission, then just leads to a situation where those will preempt the moment when that happens. So I think we shouldn't over emphasize this. I think it does raise questions about the next lot of commissioners. But I wouldn't so much tie it to individuals. I would tie it more towards the kind of background they're coming from, the kind of attitude they will bring to the job. I think the risk is, given also how some of the elections have gone in Europe over the last years, is that we get more nationally oriented, more difficult commissioners who are not willing to work together, which also has a very big impact on the way the commission works. In particular, what kind of decisions can you take in the college as a whole? How much information is being shared between the different parts of the commission? So that for me is a big question. The other big question, which tends to get forgotten a bit, but it's also the composition of the parliament and how constructive the parliament is going to be. And my guess would be that for the next commission, we're actually looking at something where much more will have to be achieved with some form of executive power rather than legislative powers.
Okay. I did want to raise, in that context of the next commission, the next EU leadership, something not directly related to the speech today, but to the G20 meeting that we've just seen. And namely, that is the relationship between Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, because we saw at that meeting something even from a Brussels insider perspective, seemed somewhat bizarre, of bilateral meetings, each of them having many bilateral meetings on their own with key leaders, only one together with the Indian Prime Minister, the host Narendra Modi, and they were putting out separate statements on issues like relations with China. As I say, even as a Brussels insider, this seemed more stark and more marked than ever. What should we read into this, Fabian? How damaging do you think what is clearly a dysfunctional relationship between them is having on the EU's reputation on the world stage? And maybe to Janis, do we need to think?
I've lost.
Yes,
Jacki.
same for me.
Yeah.
I think I know what you wanted to ask me. So maybe you start with the first one, and then
I'll answer the first bit and then hand over to you, and then hopefully Jacki will be back. I mean, I think, to be very blunt, we have a dysfunctional relationship, which is rather serious. It is hampering how Europe can act as a geopolitical actor. It is also hampering how you make the connection between the member states and the European institutions. I think that is a major issue which we're facing. But I don't see that this can be resolved with the current personalities in place. It has gone on for too long. But for the European system as a whole, that cooperation between the Commission President and the Council President is actually rather important. And we are really lacking a constructive way forward on that at the moment. Jacki, we just answered the questions which we thought you were asking. So I'll hand over to Janis and then he can come back in.
I think so Fabian responded to the first question, and the second one where you had to leave us. I think you were trying to indicate of whether we're taking the lessons out of what we saw now at the G20, also more from an institutional perspective. And I fear that we don't. I fear that also when listening to debates about the next EU leadership, we are trapped in the old logic. The question is, who gets what in terms of party political affiliation in a complex outcome of the EP elections, who gets what in terms of personalities, which countries gets what. So we're stuck in this old logic. And I fear that there might be a repetition of what we've seen in the past without thinking of how significant the interrelationship between the President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission is. And I think that the example of G20, I would even card a bizarre relationship between the two of them. The example of that shows us how important it is to think of the interrelationship between the two sides of Rue de la Loi. But that's not being thought of. And I think that this is an omission, and I hope that someone at some point will put it into the equation when the discussions will come up and will be heated about who gets which job, that one also have that dimension in mind. I'm not sure that this will be the case, but I think it is extremely important because, and I'm opening up a bit the perspective here, if leadership is now a scarce commodity at the European level, and we see that a lot of member states, a lot of governments are weak, are under pressure, and that is hampering the quality of leadership at the member state level, you need to have a strong president of the European Council who knows what his role is and who is able to work with his counterpart to compensate for the fact that sometimes, often, we can see that at the European level there is a leadership gap when it comes to the EU27.
Just one thing, and apologies that I dropped the line for just a moment there. One thing that is very striking is how much in this relationship personalities have always mattered, and the personal relationship has always mattered. It isn't structurally robust enough to withstand when the personal relations break down. We are almost out of time, and I just wanted to, as Ursula von der Leyen did in her speech, she started with the call of history. She ended saying, this is Europe's moment to answer the call of history. She also pointed out, as we mentioned earlier, in just under 300 days, Europeans will take to the polls in what she called our unique and remarkable. She talked about her priorities, and we've talked about those, but I wanted to get your personal perspective in a minute or two each. Fabian, for you, what do you believe should be the top priority of this, maybe the only, we don't know yet, but the first von der Leyen Commission for its final year in office, if we are indeed to answer what you called the call of the future, not the call of history? Same question to both of you.
Well, the first comment just on the election, I think we shouldn't lose sight that there's another election coming. And in many ways, that election across the pond is probably the more important one, because it will determine a lot of the geopolitical, the geostrategic direction for Europe. So I think that is one thing to certainly look out. And I think this is also my answer to what should be the priorities of this commission. The priorities of this commission should be to deal with the world as it is in which we live now, which is far more challenging and far more difficult precisely because it isn't reducible to one area. It isn't reducible to a silver bullet, which we can put in place to address. We are going to have to address a number of different topics much more seriously than we have in the past, from economic security to enlargement, all the things we've talked about. As Janis has said, security and defense wasn't even there, even though this is a major issue which we're going to have to handle. And all of those, we have to look at the interactions and in particular, the negative trade-offs between them. You are going to have to find billions and billions, trillions in terms of investments into some of these areas. And that means we will have to have sacrifices, we will have to make choices, and we will have to overcome some of the political blockages which are there. And that, I think, is the key issue we're going to have to address, is how are we going to work together as Europeans to address these momentous challenges? And the Commission certainly has a role in this, but I would also say it's not just the institutions. This is a challenge for member states, for institutions, for all of us.
Thank you. Janis, briefly, if you would.
First point, adding to the elections, we also have the Polish elections on the 15th of October, which are extremely significant for the country, but also from an EU perspective. I sometimes wonder why we're not discussing it much more. Second, this commission still has some things to deliver on. Look, for example, on the new pact, where there's things still that need to be done, and there are other things which still need to be done, and who knows where we will find ourselves in 3 months or 6 months' time. We've learned that we never know where things will be in a couple of months' time. But the last point is, when it comes to the priorities, for me, what is very worrisome, and also reflecting the fact that she started her speech by looking into the EP elections, is that actually the EU, in many debates at national level, is not playing a key role. people are looking into different issues, but they're not predominantly looking at through a European perspective or through an EU perspective. And they're looking at things very much from a national perspective. And so I fear that when we get to the European Parliament election, contrary to what we had in 2019, that a lot of people will ask themselves, are these elections really important? Will they be asking these questions? Or will they be rather be saying, this is an opportunity to show the yellow and the red card, as they have so often done in the past? And that, I think, if that then leads to successes of anti-EU, critical EU forces at the national level, that will be very bad news also at the European level, because it will weaken the maneuver, the ability of traditional forces in member states to maneuver, and also at the European level, it will minimize the room of maneuver with respect to being even much more ambitious than we need to be, if this is the call for history, or, I'm not quoting Fabian, the call of the future.
Thank you very much indeed. I wish we had longer to continue this discussion, but thank you so much to both of you, and thank you to you, all of you, for joining us today. Just to flag up a few EPC activities, one related to the conversation we've just been having. There will be views from EPC analysts on different aspects of the State of the Union speech. Watch out for those. Next week, there will be a discussion paper on planetary health in connection with an event and a project the EPC has been running with partners next Tuesday. Other events over the next week include, on Thursday, Spain's priorities for its presidency of the Council with the Spanish Perm Rep. On Friday, EPC talks politics with Olya Stefanisha, I think I mispronounced that, Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine. On Tuesday, an event on the digital single market and Europe's vision for the digital day. The EPC talking geopolitics again with David O'Sullivan, International Special Envoy for EU Sanctions, and of course, former chair of the EPC's governing board, among many other things. And we will be back with another update after that informal summit in Granada that we mentioned earlier on. That takes place early next month. We hope many of you will be able to join us again. But for today, gentlemen, all of you, thank you very much indeed.